everyone, welcome back to another video, or welcome if you are new to my channel. If you have been here before, you might be able to see that we're not in the usual place where I film. I've had such a tired feeling day today. I've just felt exhausted all day, to be perfectly honest, and I just really wanted to be cozy, so I thought, let's film from my bed today. And I also thought, whilst I'm in bed, I could do some fluffy mic scratching throughout this, or brushing throughout this video. I hope you enjoy the sounds of it. I'll just do it like intermittently, so let me know if you like it or not. Because I've been thinking lately, like, do we like these videos to be purely whispers, or do we like a little sound like this added in, or maybe rain sounds, something like that? Let me know. I hope this sounds nice for you guys. So, today we're doing another true crime case, and this one is known as The Staircase due to a Netflix documentary of the same name. Now, I think this documentary came out, I can't remember what year to be honest, but it was a few years back, and I watched it back then, but I didn't rewatch it for this, to make this video, because it is the longest true crime documentary I think that exists. It's like 11 or 12 parts long, and it just doesn't need to be that long. And it's also not comprehensive. You would think that something as long as this documentary would have all the details necessary, but it doesn't. And it also has quite a biased viewpoint, but we'll touch more on that later. So, this case is about the death of Kathleen Peterson. So we'll start with a bit of background about Kathleen. She was born Kathleen Hunt on February 21st, 1959 in Greensboro, North Carolina. And she was a very intelligent woman. She graduated at the top of her class at J.B. McCaskey High School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which consisted of 473 students. She was also the first woman to ever be accepted into the School of Engineering at Duke University, where she earned a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and a Master's in Mechanical Engineering. After this, she went on to work at pharmaceutical and IT companies in high-level executive positions. And Kathleen was very well liked. She was also a big member of her community. She served on the board of the Durham Arts Council, where she received multiple awards for her leadership skills. She was also a very generous philanthropist. And in 1977, Kathleen married her first husband, Fred Atwater, and they ended up having a daughter together named Caitlin. But after 10 years, their marriage just wasn't working anymore, and so they decided to part ways and get a divorce in 1985. Not too long after their divorce, Kathleen was introduced to someone new, a dad from her daughter's school, Michael Peterson. So now that we've met Michael, let's give a bit of background about him. He was born Michael up getting discharged after sustaining an injury during a car accident, and the injury was pretty bad, which left him permanently disabled. After this, he and his wife moved to Germany, where they had 2 sons, Clayton and Todd. Patricia worked as an elementary school teacher at the military base, and whilst there she met Elizabeth Radcliffe and they became fast friends, like best friends. Elizabeth had a husband named George, and they also had 2 kids, Margaret and Martha. And the 2 families got along really well, and they'd spend a lot of time together. George was also a captain in the military, so he and Michael had a lot to bond over and talk about, and they really liked each other. But unfortunately, George suddenly passed away in 1983 of a heart attack during the US invasion of Grenada. And this was very shocking to his family, and it was such a loss for them. So the Petersons really stepped up and tried to be there for their friends as much as they could to help them through this tough time. And Michael really took it upon himself to try and be like a father figure to the daughters George had left behind, Margaret and Martha. And as I said, the family were very close with Elizabeth, and she seemed to be very grateful to Michael for stepping in and helping her family grieve and move on with their lives. But unfortunately, just as Margaret and Martha were starting to get used to their life without their dad around, their mother Elizabeth also suddenly passed away in 1985, just 2 years after losing their dad. The medical examiner determined that Elizabeth died from an intercerebral hemorrhage, secondary to von Willebrand's disease, which is a blood clot disease that she suffered from. And this was, just as you can imagine, absolutely devastating for the girls. They'd lost both parents within a couple of years of each other, and they had no idea what their future was going to look like now without any parents. Elizabeth's body was brought back to the United States and buried in Bay City, Texas. So now, Margaret and Martha are orphans. So Michael Peterson became their legal guardian. And it was soon after this that Michael's marriage with Patricia started going downhill, and they end up getting divorced in 1986. He eventually moved back to the States with Margaret and Martha, leaving his sons to live with Patricia in Germany. Once they were back in North Carolina, he formally adopted the girls, so he's now their official parent. And then, not long after, both his sons actually came to live with him in America as well. So there's the 4 children and Michael living together in the States. He started working as a columnist for the local Durham Herald-Sun newspaper, where he became known for criticizing the police department and the district attorney. He also spent time writing about his experience in the military and actually wrote multiple military-related novels. And he reportedly did pretty well as a writer. Apparently he got a $500,000 advance for one of his books, and Hollywood in with them, and they referred to it as being like a permanent sleepover. In 1996, Kathleen and Michael got married and raised their family in a 9,000 square foot mansion in the Forest Hills neighborhood of Durham, North Carolina. Michael and Kathleen were said to have had a fairy tale romance. They were madly in love and completely devoted to their new family that they'd managed to just seamlessly blend together. Everyone got along really well, and it just seemed to work out perfectly for them. They were all very happy with their new arrangement. Kathleen and Michael were successful in their careers and were very involved in their community. They had a wide circle of friends, and everyone in the neighborhood really liked them. People loved how Michael had adopted the girls and that these two families had found happiness together. But that all changed on December 9th, 2001. At around 2:40 a.m., 911 received a call from Michael saying that he had found Kathleen at the bottom of their back staircase. He sounded very panicked, saying that she'd fallen down the stairs and that they needed to come right away. The dispatcher asked how many stairs she had fallen down, and he estimated about 15 to 20. So, a big fall. Michael's son Todd was over at a friend's house, so Michael called him and told him what happened, and he came back to the house before the ambulance got there. When first responders got to the scene, they were shocked at the amount of blood there was for a fall down the stairs, because there was a lot of it. Now, as I mentioned, Kathleen was found at the bottom of the back staircase, so they had two staircases in the home, and this one was located towards the back of the house and was very narrow and enclosed. So it's not the main staircase of the house, it's like a smaller one, and from the footage of it, it looks like it's made of wood with no carpet or anything to soften the blow of falling down the stairs. But even so, the amount of blood was just shocking. Kathleen was found with her head on the last step and her legs splayed out in front of her going into the hallway, so she's no longer in the staircase. Just her head is on the stairs, but the rest of her body is in the hallway. And there was blood all over the walls of the staircase, all the way down to where she was at the bottom, including on the stairs, on the faceplates of the stairs, and a pool of blood at the bottom of the stairs. There was also a tremendous amount of blood on her clothing, so it really was everywhere. Kathleen got rushed to hospital, but unfortunately it was too late. She had died from her injuries at only 48 years old. And straight away, this whole scenario of a woman taking such a brutal tumble down the stairs that it kills her seems unbelievable. And with the amount of blood, it just seemed like it was all too much to just be generated from falling down the stairs. So how did this happen? Michael said it was a perfectly normal day. He and Kathleen had watched a movie that night, America's Sweethearts. Then afterwards, they went out and relaxed by the pool with some drinks, just having a nice time and chatting together. And they stayed out there till quite late. Eventually, Kathleen decided to go back into the house, and Michael stayed out by the pool smoking his pipe. He then goes into the house at around 2:40 a.m. and finds Kathleen at the bottom of the stairs. He said he immediately assumed that she had fallen down them and called 911 right away. Investigators found a bottle of wine and 2 wine glasses in the garden, so that corroborates Michael's story that they were drinking and hanging out back there. But they just couldn't get past the sheer amount of blood that was at the scene. it was way more than you would expect from a fall down the stairs. And as the police gathered more information from Michael about what happened that night, the more they started to question his story. So, evidence was collected and a case was started to be built against Michael. On December 20th, 2001, they finally had enough evidence to charge Michael Peterson with Kathleen's murder. And this shocked everyone. The family were adamant that he would never do something like this and refused to believe it was true. And their friends and neighbours all thought Michael was a great guy and that him and Kathleen were a beautiful couple and there's just no way he would have harmed her. Michael himself was also really shocked at being arrested. He said he never dreamed anyone would think that he would kill his wife. After a month in prison, Michael was released on an $850,000 bond, and he had to give up a lot of his possessions, his wallet, his car, his passport, and he wasn't allowed to travel anywhere, not even leave the state. And this is when Michael spoke publicly for the first time, saying, "Kathleen was my life. I whispered her name in my heart 1,000 times. She is there, but I can't stop crying. I would never have done anything to hurt her. I am innocent of these charges, and we will prove it in court." In the footage of this speech, he does appear quite dishevelled and very upset, and the public were really torn on what to think about this whole situation, because he had a really good reputation in the local area. A lot of people really liked him, and so most people believed him to be innocent, and still do to this day. Jury selection started in May of 2003, and the trial was set to begin in July. In the lead up to the trial, Michael's friends and family really stood up for him, and publicly stated their support for him, including his adoptive daughters. They really believed he was innocent, and so did his ex-wife, Patricia, who actually became good friends with Kathleen, so he was still on good terms with his ex-wife. She didn't think there was any way that Michael would have done this. She said she knew Michael was innocent and that he would never hurt Kathleen. He just wasn't violent like that. She said he truly loved her and that they would have stayed together forever if she hadn't passed away. Michael also repeatedly insisted his innocence and said that he would never have wanted to end Kathleen's life, that she was the best thing that had happened to him. And he continually talked about the great times they'd had together over the past 14 years. So, Michael was represented by Charlotte attorney David Rudolph. Now, David decided that they were going to argue that Kathleen had mixed alcohol and Valium together. Valium being the prescription drug that helps with anxiety and sleep, which, when taken together, would have made her very dizzy and disorientated, and that as she was trying to walk up the stairs that were narrow and dark in a pair of flip-flops, it would have been easy for her to fall. Now, what shocked a lot of people is that she fell walking up the stairs, because naturally you would think that if someone took such a bad tumble down the stairs that it killed them, you would assume that they're coming down the stairs and that they would fall from basically the very top. But Kathleen actually fell going up, and it was only a few steps up as well. It wasn't all the way to the top. But they argued that she fell several times. So they say that after the first fall, she struggled to get up and then fell again. And they said that she may have fallen more than that, trying to get up several times, falling again, slipping, and hitting her head over and over, which caused her death. They claimed that falls can happen in a million different ways and with a million different variations. And they said that their experts would explain that the injuries on Kathleen's I was just thinking, if this was me, right, if I fall going up the stairs and hurt my head quite badly, I'm likely to go outside to my husband and tell him that I've hurt my head. Unless maybe it wasn't bleeding that first time, so maybe I would have tried again. But if I fall a second time and hurt my head again, I'm definitely not going up the stairs on my own. Like, I just don't see someone trying to go repeatedly up the stairs once they have hit their head and it's potentially bleeding. Because if it is bleeding, then there's likely going to be blood on the floor, which makes it slippery. So I just don't know. I feel like someone wouldn't keep attempting to do that without help from their husband when he's nearby. It just doesn't really make sense to me, but that was just my 2 cents. The defense brought in a man named Henry Lee to assist in their case. He's a blood spatter analyst and forensic expert. And once he took a look at everything, he concluded that Kathleen's injuries were the result of a tragic accidental fall, and that the volume of blood at the scene was irrelevant. He said that she was bleeding profusely from the injuries on her head and coughing up blood at the same time. Now, Henry Lee was quite controversial because in court he did something a little bit weird. He brought out ketchup, put it in his mouth, and spat it out onto a bit of paper to try and show what the blood spatter would look like if you were coughing up blood. And a lot of people didn't like this. They thought it was disrespectful and just not a real scientific method for a court case. So the prosecution completely disagreed with this. Kathleen's injuries make everything even more confusing because she had multiple head lacerations that looked as if either someone had hit her over the head with an object or she'd been scratched by someone or something. But she had no bruises on her arms or legs, which I would have thought you would expect to see bruises if you've fallen down the stairs. And now Michael kept pushing the idea that Kathleen was drinking a lot that night, but when they did a blood alcohol test on her, it came back at 0.07% blood alcohol level. You're still allowed to drive at that point until you hit 0.08%, so she definitely wasn't drunk. The autopsy report showed that she had about 6 or 7 deep lacerations on the top and back of her head, which were likely caused by repeated blows from a light, rigid object. She also had a fracture of the thyroid neck cartilage, which indicates an intense amount of pressure on the neck, possibly from strangulation. Another thing to note is that when first responders got to the scene, most of the blood around Kathleen had already dried, meaning she was probably laying there for quite some time. The neurons in her brain showed that she was alive and unconscious for at least 90 minutes and possibly for up to 2 hours before she actually died. And the medical examiner, Deborah Radish, actually ended up ruling Kathleen's death as a homicide, stating, at the end of the autopsy examination, taking into account the number of scalp lacerations, their locations, their orientation, together with the neck injury, the findings were unequivocal that this was not from a fall down the stairs. So the fact that she was found at the bottom of the stairs indicates that either an incident had happened on the stairs or perhaps she had been placed there for it to look like she had fallen. The prosecution presented the idea that a blow poke for a fireplace could have been used to hit her and cause these lacerations. A blow poke is something that you would use to stoke a fire, but it's also something you can blow down, so it's hollow, so it's not super heavy. And it turns out that the couple owned it was just easier sometimes to let the lie come out. So now, the prosecution needed to show that Michael had lied on the night of Kathleen's death. And the evidence that they brought forward for this was those 2 wine glasses that were sitting out in the garden where they were supposedly drinking together. Because it turns out that neither of these glasses had Kathleen's fingerprints on. They also brought in their own blood spatter analyst, Dwayne Deaver, to counteract what Harvey Lee had said. And he said that the blood spatter on the walls and around the staircase was from someone bludgeoning Kathleen to death, lifting up the murder weapon over and over again, flinging blood around and coming into contact with the walls, not from her coughing up blood. The stains on her pants were consistent with impact splatter as a result of a forceful impact, and that the individual wearing these pants at the time of the impact was in close proximity to the source of the blood when it was impacted. So now they need to show motive. They have to prove why Michael would want to kill Kathleen. And this is where they dropped a big bombshell in court. They had evidence that Michael was bisexual and was having an affair with another man. Investigators discovered over 2,000 photos of men on his computer, and they also found a conversation between Michael and a 26-year-old male escort named Brent Walgemont, who they brought into court to testify. They asked Brent what type of services he performed, and he responded saying companionship for other males of legal age. When asked if that sometimes involved sexual activity, he said yes, sometimes it does. And it turns out that Michael and Brent had been talking for at least 4 months prior to Kathleen's death, but as far as we know, it was all online. But they did have plans to meet up in person fairly soon. Now, the night Kathleen died, she asked Michael if she could use his computer to prep for a conference call the next day. So they theorized that Kathleen may have come across these images, and not only that, but Michael had printed out pages of his conversations with the escort and put them in his desk drawer. And they were talking about where they planned to meet and what sexual acts they were going to do. So they presented the idea that Kathleen discovered Michael was cheating on her, confronted him about it, and then they got into a fight. And maybe this fight got violent. Maybe Michael beat Kathleen to death and then staged it to look like she fell down the stairs. One of the district attorneys on the prosecution, Frida Black, really tried to emphasize his sexuality during the case. You know, making a big deal out of it, and that he's got a secret side to himself. But Michael claimed that Kathleen was aware that he was bisexual and that she was fine with it. But that doesn't mean she's okay with him having an affair, so that doesn't really mean anything. But the defense argued that if he was trying to hide this part of him, why would he print out conversations and leave them in his desk, or even let her use his computer at all, risking her finding everything? The next motive investigators focused on was money, and this is where things start to get especially complicated. It was revealed that the couple were in roughly $143,000 of debt and heading towards serious financial instability. They were essentially surviving month to month using credit cards. Kathleen was close to losing her job, and these financial pressures were believed to have caused significant strain inside the home. At the time, Kathleen earned $145,000 a year, but that year she had deferred a large portion of her salary and her company was actively laying off employees. Meanwhile, Michael had not had a reliable source of income for several years. his writing career never reached the level of success that he'd hoped for. On top of that, it came out that his sons were also deeply in debt. Investigators uncovered emails between Michael and Patricia discussing their son's financial problems. In one of those messages, Michael specifically said that he needed to keep the situation hidden from Kathleen. Then attention turned to Kathleen's life insurance policy. The payout Michael Peterson stood to receive in the event of Kathleen's death totaled $1,834,166, so a big sum of money that would solve his debt problems. But in order to collect that money, Kathleen's death would need to be ruled as an accident. Prosecutors argued that Michael may have developed this idea years earlier, back when he was living in Germany with his first wife, and this is where the case takes a dramatic turn. So when Michael and Patricia were living in Germany, and their friend George died, leaving Elizabeth and her daughters behind before he'd adopted them. Elizabeth had a sister named Margaret Blair, and when she learned that Michael's second wife Kathleen had died after falling down the stairs, she immediately contacted authorities. What concerned her was how similar Kathleen's death appeared to be to Elizabeth's. According to Elizabeth's sister, Elizabeth and her daughters had dinner at the Peterson home that evening. Afterwards, they returned home and Michael walked them back to the house. And later that night, a neighbour reported seeing Michael running away from Elizabeth's house. The following morning, Elizabeth was discovered dead at the bottom of her staircase by the girl's nanny, Barbara, in a position strikingly similar to how Kathleen was found. Even more unsettling, Elizabeth had lacerations on the back of her head that closely resembled Kathleen's injuries. In the weeks leading up to her death, Elizabeth had reportedly been suffering from severe headaches. Because of this, the medical examiner concluded that she had suffered an intracerebral hemorrhage, collapsed and fell down the stairs. German police and US military police both investigated her death at the time, and it was ruled a death from natural causes and an accident, not a homicide. However, something didn't add up. Official police reports noted very little blood at the scene, but Barbara, the nanny who found Elizabeth, told a very different story. She stated that there was blood everywhere. She later described looking at the wall and seeing blood spatter reaching incredibly high. When asked how high, she explained that she was nearly 6 feet tall and the blood was higher than her outstretched hand. She couldn't understand how blood could have reached that height from the fall down the stairs. Barbara also recalled that Michael was coming and going from the house, interacting with military personnel. Michael told people that Elizabeth had suffered a brain aneurysm and fallen down the stairs. Another witness, a woman who helped clean the scene, testified that it took hours to remove all the blood from the staircase. When the Elizabeth Ratcliffe case resurfaced, it shocked everyone. Friends and family began reconsidering their opinions because it seemed nearly impossible that one person could be connected to two nearly identical staircase deaths. Deaths caused by falling down the stairs is rare, and having two linked to the same individual was seen as a major turning point, and this is when public opinion shifted significantly. As a result, prosecutors decided to exhume Elizabeth Ratcliffe's body. The autopsy was conducted by Deborah Radish, the same medical examiner missing from the home, and during the trial, the defence suddenly produced this blowpoke. Michael's son claimed he found it in the garage, an area that the police had searched multiple times. The blowpoke was covered in spider webs, raising questions about whether it had been placed there later. Forensic testing showed that it hadn't been used in years, well before Kathleen's death, meaning it couldn't be definitively used as the murder weapon. This severely weakened the prosecution's case. At the same time, the jury appeared unimpressed with the prosecution's conduct. They were criticised for behaving unprofessionally, sometimes even celebrating test results. After the blowpoke issue, the case against Michael seemed increasingly unstable. The jury was eventually taken to the Peterson home to view the staircase firsthand, as well as the pool area where Michael and Kathleen had been earlier in the evening. This helped them understand the layout and distances involved. The trial stretched on for 3 months, making it the longest trial in North Carolina history. During deliberations, the jury concluded that the blowpoke could not be proven as the murder weapon and chose not to consider Elizabeth Rapleth's death, ruling it irrelevant. Ultimately, on October 10, 2003, Michael Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, with the jury determining the crime was premeditated, even if that was only for a few mere seconds beforehand. Michael and his daughters were devastated. In court, he whispered to them that he loved them and that he would be okay. Over the course of the trial, Michael lost many supporters. Even Kathleen's daughter changed her opinion after reviewing the autopsy photos, realizing that the injuries could not possibly be explained by a fall. Experts testified that parts of the blood appeared to have been wiped as if someone had attempted to clean the scene and then stopped. And Michael was the only other person present. Kathleen's sister Candice also withdrew her support after learning more about Michael's bisexuality and the state of their marriage. And eventually, much of the family cut ties with him, but Michael continued to maintain his innocence and immediately began filing appeals. In 2006, a court-appointed attorney argued that Michael had not received a fair trial, citing judicial and prosecutorial errors. The appeal was denied, and the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld that decision in 2007. In 2008, Michael hired new attorneys who challenged the testimony of Dwayne Deaver, the SBI blood spatter analyst. And although the motion was denied in 2009, concerns about Deaver's qualifications gained traction. In 2010, the Attorney General launched an investigation and found that Deaver had misrepresented or withheld evidence in over 34 cases across 16 years, and he was fired in 2011. David Rudolph returned to represent Michael pro bono, believing him to be innocent. A judge ultimately ruled that Michael had not received a fair trial due to Deaver's misconduct and granted a new trial. Michael was released on December 16, 2011 on house arrest with $300,000 bail, and a new trial was scheduled for May 2017, but it never occurred. Instead, Michael entered an Alford plea in February of 2017, which means that he pled guilty to voluntary manslaughter whilst also maintaining his innocence. It's a weird thing you can do. He was sentenced to 86 months, but having already served 89 months, he was released immediately, and Michael remains a free man today. The documentary The Staircase, directed by Oscar winner Jean-Xavier de Lestrade, I probably butchered his name, began filming within weeks of Kathleen's death. marketed as unbiased, many viewers believe it strongly favours Michael, a bias even acknowledged by the director. And it later emerged that the documentary's editor had a romantic relationship with Michael whilst he was in prison, and they eventually moved in together after his release. So that's a little bit suspicious that this documentary that favours him and puts him in a good light was being edited by someone he was dating. So because there's just so much controversy surrounding this case, there are still lots of theories as to what people think really happened. So let's go through some of those, because even years later people still wonder what really happened. One significant legal development that often gets overlooked is that in October of 2002, Caitlin Atwater, Kathleen's daughter, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Michael Peterson. This civil case existed separately from the criminal trial. Michael later attempted to file for bankruptcy in 2006, but Kathleen's estate immediately objected. Ultimately, in February of 2007, Michael agreed to a $25 million settlement, but he never admitted to killing Kathleen as part of that agreement. From a forensic standpoint, despite serious issues with the prosecution's expert testimony, particularly the blood spatter analyst, the physical evidence at the scene remains difficult to ignore. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was the discovery of a bloody shoe print on Kathleen's sweatpants, and that print was later determined to be consistent with a pair of Michael's shoes. However, when paramedics arrived at the scene, Michael was barefoot, and his shoes and socks were found near Kathleen's body. This raised obvious questions about why he would have removed them and when exactly that had happened. A luminol test revealed bare footprints throughout the house and extending into the backyard. And these footprints appeared to indicate that someone had been walking around after Kathleen was already heavily bleeding. Prosecutors suggested this could mean Michael left her at the staircase and moved around the house, possibly attempting to decide how to stage the scene or trying to clean up before he called 911. Adding to the confusion, investigators found blood droplets inside Michael's shorts, which he claimed must have transferred when he tried to help Kathleen. His clothing that night also raised eyebrows. He stated he was outside by the pool, wearing only a t-shirt, shorts and no shoes, despite the temperature being only 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The missing blowpoke added yet another layer of controversy. Whilst the defence argued that it couldn't have been the murder weapon because it was later found downstairs covered in spiderwebs, it's important to note that they never turned it over to the police for proper evidence handling when it was supposedly found. Instead, it was dramatically introduced in court, meaning its evidentiary value was already compromised. To this day, there's no definitive proof that it wasn't used, only that it couldn't be conclusively proven that it was. So, they just didn't handle the whole blowpoke thing properly at all. Another unsettling detail is the behaviour of Michael's son, who was reportedly at the house before first responders arrived. Despite this, he refused to speak with police entirely and never gave a statement. And whilst that is legally within his rights, this decision struck many people as highly unusual and fueled speculation that he might have been protecting his father or just knew more about the situation and he wasn't willing to speak about it. The intruder theory has been raised, but it's widely considered unlikely. Michael reported a burglar initially claiming his phone was stolen, but it later turned out to be his son's phone. He also claimed there were several car break-ins in the neighbourhood around that time. The defence suggested that Michael's past as a journalist, critical of law enforcement, might have made him a target, but most people find this explanation unconvincing given the lack of disturbance inside the home. There's also lingering frustration over the fact that Kathleen's clothing was never tested for third-party DNA, meaning investigators can't definitively rule out another person's involvement. So, again, just one of those cases where it seems like the police didn't really do their job properly. And then the final theory, which is a little bit out there, but some people think it has some credence to it. So, this is the owl theory. One of their neighbours, T. Lawrence Pollard, who was a lawyer, came up with the theory that Kathleen was attacked by a barn owl because the lacerations on her head looked like they could have come from talons. He said that there's loads of owls in the area and it's not uncommon for them to dive bomb people, so he theorised that she got dive bombed by a barn owl outside and then ran into the house trying to escape. But people argue that this is virtually unheard of and there was no evidence of an attack outside the home. Also, like, if that really did happen and it happened outside, then Michael would have been witness to that, and surely if you saw your wife get dive bombed by an owl, you would run to help her. And if she's outside, why would she not run to her husband? Why would she run up a narrow staircase where it could potentially follow her and get stuck inside and the situation get worse? It doesn't really make sense, but what's interesting is that examiners did find that she was clutching a bunch of her own hair that she'd ripped from her head, and within that hair were microscopic feathers, as well as a small sliver of wood. So it kind of like makes you wonder if this could be true. Prosecutors and medical examiners dismissed this theory as implausible, but still even David Rudolph, his old attorney, later acknowledged that the slip and fall explanation never fully made sense to him, and he eventually came to believe that the owl theory was possible, but it was introduced too late to be presented at trial. That's such a wild theory, and something that occurred to me is that, as far as I'm aware, these feathers never got identified as being from an owl. So they could have come from anywhere, like they could have come from a down pillow. You know, if they got into a fight upstairs, maybe a pillow was somehow involved. And if it's true that the scene appeared to look as if someone had attempted to clean up the blood with the smearing on the walls, who's to say that even though he gave up with the blood, he didn't clean up a load of feathers coming from a pillow or something? You know, it just seems unlikely that she would be running away from an owl, and Michael didn't jump in to help her fight it off, and he didn't think to mention this during the trial. So to this day, even though he was sent to prison for killing her, no one truly knows what happened to Kathleen, and it may remain unsolved forever because Michael claims his innocence even to this day. So even though, you know, I kind of did come to a conclusion that it was him, he just completely refuses that it was. I'm not sure what I think, to be honest. I think it's highly suspicious that there are two women in his life that died by falling down the stairs. Now, I know that coincidences happen, and sometimes crazy ones, because crazy coincidences happen to them. But this, two women falling down the stairs and dying and leaving an obscene amount of blood that you just wouldn't expect from falling down the stairs. It's just too much of a coincidence for me, personally. I think he must have had some role in this. I don't know. What do you guys think? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so